Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula podcast. And today I'd like to start out by reminding you that there is a website behind the madness. It's called wealthformula.com, and it has all sorts of goodies on there, downloads that are useful, etc., etc. You can get a copy of my free book, 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth. You can also get that simply by texting 44222 and typing Wealth Formula, one word. Again, that's 44222, Wealth Formula, one word. And also, for those of you who are really into Wealth Formula and who want more, there is a course, there's a forum, there is bi-weekly mastermind calls. Now there's a private Facebook group, and it's all part of your roadmap to real wealth. This is available through, check out this site, wealthformularoadmap.com. Again, it's wealthformularoadmap.com. And if you want more wealth formula, that's the way to get it. The course is fantastic. Obviously, we've talked about it before. We've got Kevin Day. We've got Ken McElroy, Tom Wheelwright, the real estate guys, Christian Allen, Dean Graziosi, me. It's just a fantastic course to get you up to speed. And then you've got this whole community and mastermind call thing. Don't miss it. It's really cheap, okay? I have to tell you, I just think it's, compared to the amount of money I pay for stuff, this is not expensive. And I think it's really worthwhile. I think the calls alone, by the way, are probably significant value. We had last week, I think we had Kevin Day. A couple of weeks before that on our mastermind call, we had Christian Allen really diving into wealth formula banking, which, of course, you can check that out on wealthformulabanking.com. Really just got granular with this stuff. And I think that's, it's time to sort of get off the couch, get that lazy money, whip it into shape, and, join the network. So so as far as today, let's start talking about the theme of the day. Let's start out back in high school. For me, I graduated in high school in 1992. So I'm a child of I'm a Generation X guy, Gen X. And I remember taking my first political science course. I think it was during my senior year, and it was, sort of during my senior slides. I wasn't reading much. I was kind of, I'd already gotten into college. I didn't really care. And I think I tried to take some tests without even, reading anything, and I bombed in. It was because I didn't know the true meaning of the words conservative or liberal. Up to this point, I viewed these words as synonymous with Republican or Democrat. Of course, I found out from the grade I got there that wasn't quite the same thing. Conservative, I learned, was someone who desired smaller government, less regulation, and emphasized the importance of individual civil liberties. I got the small government part right. That was the Republicans at the time. But the American Civil Liberties Union was, from everything I gathered on the news at that time, an institution of the Democrats. So I was kind of confused of why that would be. I mean, somewhere along the line, conservative in political slang became very different from what conservative by political definition actually meant. And if with perspective, of course, since high school, 25 years ago? Wow, I'm old. I guess with that perspective, it's not hard to understand how that all changed, right? I mean, look at free trade, what we call free trade, the kind of NAFTA type of thing, the kind of, no trade war, no tariffs kind of thing. It used to be the case back in my day that tariffs and trade wars were loathed by Republicans. right? They were loathed by them. But now Donald Trump is the champion of global isolationism, right? Now, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, and again, this is not saying the policy is right or wrong, but understand his ideology is not that of Ronald Reagan, who is, of course, the quintessential conservative icon of the 1980s. So how does that make sense? So with ideology in each part, start that over. So with ideology in each party being as, I guess, fluid as it is, it seems odd to me that politicians aren't switching parties all the time, or maybe not, you know? I mean, how could they be part of a party that no longer represents their beliefs? Well, because they're politicians, right? And then it's all just, you know, it's like a big just thing about getting reelected, I guess. I don't know. You know, what's stranger to me about American politics these days is that it's becoming more and more polarized. I mean, I really believe that most of this country, despite what you see in sound bites on cable television, is actually sort of center right. I think there's actually some statistics to back that up too. But the primary system, you know, the system where you put up the candidate, where they, you know, where the Democrats and the Republicans decide who they're going to put up for president, well, that brings in the candidates that cater to the most extreme elements on either side. And boy, are you going to see that in the Democratic Party next time around. For those of us standing rationally in the middle, though, and you know, I guess that's a little political, right? Because if I'm sort of in the middle and the right, I'm being political. So I don't usually do that. But anyway, that's me. And if that gives us little in the way of politicians that accurately reflect our collective sentiments as a nation, you know, personally, I've grown further in the direction of what is known as libertarian ideology. Now, that is an ideology. It's also a party. You know, my intent on this show, of course, is never to be political. You know, you should believe what you want to believe. Just think about it, please. But I probably leaked out some of my sentiments in the past. But rather than just sit there and, you know, keep this dirty little secret, I thought that the better approach might be to educate you on something that I really believe in, which is libertarian ideology. Now, when you listen to this, you may agree or you may disagree with the opinions, but you probably should listen to it. I mean, after all, everyone in Silicon Valley claims to be a libertarian these days, so you might as well know what the heck they mean, or at least what the heck they think they mean that they're talking about. So, in true well-formula fashion, I went out and got a real authority on the topic to educate you. And not just any education, a Harvard education. So when we come back, we're going to learn all about libertarianism and the economics of libertarianism from Harvard professor of economics, Jeffrey Miron. Welcome back to the show, everyone. My guest today on Well Formula Podcast is Dr. Jeffrey Miron. Professor Miron is a senior lecturer, director of undergraduate studies, and director of graduate studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard. He's also director of economic studies at the Cato Institute, which, if you don't know, you should. It's a libertarian think tank. Dr. Miron's commentary on economic policy has appeared on CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, NPR, Bloomberg, Fox, BBC, and dozens of other television, radio, and print media around the world, and now including Well Formula Podcast. His area of expertise is the economics of libertarianism, which is certainly my favorite kind of economics. Professor Miron, I'm going back between professor and doctor. I don't know what you prefer, but welcome to
Jeff. Jeff is good.
Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So I wanted to start out with what may sound like a sort of a simple question, but one I think is worth asking because a lot of people, including myself, identify themselves as libertarian. And you offer a course, I know I read as a popular course at Harvard called The Libertarian Perspective, on economic and social policy. So I want to ask you, because everybody runs around calling themselves libertarian, especially in Silicon Valley these days or San Francisco. What is a libertarian?
So I think in the simplest terms, libertarians want smaller government. They want the government to focus on respect for individual liberties and rights. And when they say smaller government, many of them mean substantially smaller government. It doesn't come from a view that government is evil. It doesn't come from a view that markets and other private arrangements are perfect. It comes mainly from the view that governments, even when well-intentioned, tend to make things worse. The treatment is often worse than the disease. So even though private arrangements are not perfect, they're typically better than when governments try to fix those private arrangements and cause unintended consequences.
Got it. So in terms of, so let's talk about it in terms specifically about what that looks like in the economy. Let's drive that way first.
So it would mean that we would have vastly reduced expenditure at the federal level in particular, also at the state level. It means either little or no spending on entitlements programs. It means far less regulation to a much greater degree in some areas than other, but overall far less regulation. Of course, if you have a much smaller government measured by expenditure, then you're going to have much lower taxes because you don't need to raise nearly as much revenue. So it would look more like, say, the first 50 or 100 years of the U.S. rather than the next 125 years.
So
in simple terms.
Right. So how about, okay, so then that's sort of the fiscal side of it. Now there's there's the social aspect, the emphasis on this, of more freedom, individual freedoms. Can you talk a little bit about some of those things, some of the positions that the libertarians might have?
Sure. So libertarians would be strong advocates of legalizing most or all drugs. They would be strong advocates of legalizing gay marriage. They're strong advocates of expanded legal immigration. Indeed, some advocate for literally open borders. Many libertarians, not exclusively, are advocates of choice as opposed to being pro-choice rather than pro-life. In the criminal justice arena, they have strong concerns that existing policies are enforced in very racially biased ways. And so they, again, are for much less government intervention with respect to people's individual decisions or interactions outside of strictly economic ones. Libertarians try to apply that respect for the individual and advocacy for small government consistently across all areas of government.
Yeah. So, and this is what's interesting to me, because you're just, at this point, you're pretty much confirming why I identify myself as a libertarian. And what strikes me as very interesting is that many people listening to this show out there are probably thinking, hey, I'm kind of a libertarian. I like small government. I don't care what you do or who you marry. But the funny thing is, in our two-party system, neither side seems to reflect these particular principles, even though they seem like a natural marriage. Freedom to do whatever you want, as long as you're not hurting somebody else, and at the same time having small government. The Republican Party certainly moving farther and farther away from those libertarian elements. But why do you think this is?
That's a puzzle for which I don't think I have a great answer. I guess what I would say, though, is that we sort of do have libertarian government. Of course, not what libertarians would ideally like. We have a lot more government than we had 200 years ago. But to a first approximation, people can start businesses as they wish. They can work in whatever occupation they want, okay, subject to some silly occupational licensing regulation, but overall, they still have a lot of choice. Marry whom they want, practice the religion that they want. Taxes, while higher than libertarians want, are not so oppressive as to destroy the economy or anything like that. So compared to the long human history, people living in the United States, other rich democracies these days, and even many other countries around the world, do have lots and lots of freedom. So yes, it's too bad that we can't get the major parties to think more like libertarians, and yet the fact that the public goes back and forth between the two parties and doesn't ever seem to settle predominantly on one or predominantly on the other, that often you see one house be Republican and the other house of Congress be Democratic, maybe that is reflecting the generally libertarian sort of sympathy that's fairly broad in the U.S. population.
Yeah, and but it seems odd to me in some ways that the increase in polarization of the parties seems to be pulling away from that sentiment in the middle. And given that, and given the fact that it seems to me, I mean, if you took a poll, and I don't know, maybe you have some kind of an idea of this, that probably the majority of the country probably would feel fiscal conservatism, probably feel fairly progressive on the social side. And then you've got a ton of money involved with this, right? Everybody in Silicon Valley says everybody
Right.
says they're a libertarian, right? So
Right.
why can't a libertarian candidate, why has a libertarian candidate been unable to get some kind of traction or make some kind of legitimate run towards the presidency?
So I think libertarians could try to blame that fact that you just described well on a lot of things, on the impediments to becoming a viable third party, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the real reason is that libertarians are kind of their own worst enemies.
Yeah.
We like to argue. We like to consider the extreme. So if we meet someone and we talk about drug policy, we manage to convince that person that maybe marijuana should be legal. We don't ever just kind of count that as a victory and shut up. We say, okay, now that I've convinced you that marijuana should be legal, let me convince you that heroin should be legal. And of course, you lose a lot of support. It's one thing to say the Medicare program is well-intentioned, but it's so expensive it's going to bankrupt the economy, so we need to cut it back a little bit. You could get a lot of people to accept that that's a rational position, but as soon as we convince people of that, then we turn around and say, but of course we should actually just get rid of the entire Medicare program. And that, of course, scares people and upsets people. Right. So the libertarians have not found their right spokesperson yet, someone who can be sort of faithful to the purity of libertarianism and the consistency, and yet present a message that's moderate enough that you could get a broad set of support.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because I think in some respects, again, the polarization of the party seems to be the perfect setup for something like that to happen. So let's shift gears again a little bit here and talk a little bit about your, put on your economics hat and talk about free markets. So obviously free markets are a big part of the libertarian ethos, and the belief that capitalism is a virtue and the ability to let ultimately anybody succeed. And as a child of immigrants who lived, the quintessential American dream because my parents had the opportunity, I am very much a capitalist with a capital C. But a lot of people on the other side, maybe a lot of the Bernie Sanders supporters, et cetera, they're looking at the mess that is 2008 and the fallout behind that, the massive debt that we've got these days, and they say, hey, capitalism looks like it failed. It didn't seem to do so good. What do you say to those people?
So I'd say a couple things. First, we had a bad situation in 2008, 2009, but it's at a minimum highly incomplete to blame that on capitalism. Capitalists made some mistakes, but they were aided and abetted enormously by the government that was trying to promote private home ownership, by the government that was guaranteeing implicitly and explicitly the liabilities of major financial intermediaries and the banks. There was a huge amount of government intervention that at a minimum contributed heavily to the fact that we had an excessive boom and then we had a significant bust. The second thing I'd say is that if you set aside a few people who are really at the extremes, even the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warrens, I think recognize that capitalism is good at producing the most stuff. If your only goal were to maximize the value of GDP per capita, how much we can produce, they would accept that with a little bit or modest amount of regulation, capitalism is quite good. But they don't like the way that the fruits of those labors, the way that GDP gets divided up in a market economy. They want way more redistribution. So they're actually not socialists in the 1950s version of socialism, where government was owning the means of production. They are just massive redistributionists. Now, I understand their concern for the people who are unfortunate, but I think they're missing the fact that most of the inequitable differences in income come from government interfering and creating arbitrary winners and losers, government helping people with lots of excessive rules who are willing to be dishonest get ahead relative to people who are more honest, government bailing out auto companies who made bad decisions or big banks who made bad decisions. So I think there is some common ground, okay, for the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing and libertarians. It's just we agree there's some bad things. They want to fix it with more government. We think we can fix it better with less government.
You know, Nomi Prinz was on the show a couple weeks ago, and she's I don't know if you know, she's in New York Times best-selling authors, but she was talking, you know, she was a Wall Street insider and talked a lot about the banks and sort of how that cartel works. And you know, the point that she ultimately brought out was, you know, there was this repeal of Glass-Steagall in the 90s that ultimately led to these banks, you know, taking really big risks, right? But presumably what you could say is, hey, if you were actually running like a true capitalist society, like a true capitalist economy, you would never have that situation set up because there would be no opportunity for a bailout. So presumably, if you didn't have the safety net of a bailout, that you wouldn't, in pure capitalism, you wouldn't have had that problem.
Exactly. It's the implicit guarantee of the banks that, in my view and libertarian view, is the single biggest cause of the problems. Pure capitalism, there's a famous line, capitalism without bankruptcy is like a religion without hell. You have to have the risk that people are going to fail and fail significantly to discipline people to behave, to not take excessive risks, to not think that they're playing with someone else's money. But the US government, major governments around the world have been bailing out the financial sector for centuries. And so, of course, the financial sector expects to be bailed out, and they act accordingly. I heard this great conversation on NPR in the midst of the 2008 crisis. Some woman calls in and says, you know, I've been yelling at my husband for years that you guys are taking crazy risks. It's all going to come crashing down. Aren't we going to lose all our retirement? And isn't you're going to get fired, et cetera? And he said, nah, don't worry about it. If the crash happens, and you're right, it probably will, the Feds will come in and bail us out. And this was just sort of a random person who, you know, was relating exactly what libertarians are arguing. Yeah. So I agree with exactly what you said.
So tell me what's going on in your view in the economy right now. There is this idea that, you know, at least in the mainstream, that the economy is doing really well, and it seems to ignore some of the, you know, some of the infrastructural problems going on. But what worries you, if anything, about what's going on with the economy right now?
The single thing that worries me the most is the buildup of debt for entitlements, the unfunded liabilities for Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and so on. Those are large, and they're growing at a rate significantly faster than we could plausibly expect the economy to grow. So they're getting big relative to the size of the economy. And if that keeps going, then of course they become the whole economy, and that can't possibly happen. So that's a huge concern. There, of course, are other significant concerns. If the current administration substantially restricts trade and other countries retaliate, that could indeed be seriously costly. And I think that the restrictions on immigration, okay, are also extremely bad for the economy. I think immigration does a lot of good things, first of all for the immigrants, but also for the native population, not just by bringing lower wages for certain types of workers, but by making the economy vital, by introducing lots of competition, by generating new ideas, sources of innovation, and things like that. And so cutting off immigration, I think, is potentially a really bad thing for the economy as well.
Let's talk a little bit about debt, because that's that's something that a lot of people talk about. Now we're what, 21, 22 trillion dollars of debt. Let me ask you a very simple question, which is, why does debt matter anyway? Can't we just deflate ourselves out of it? I mean,
we can either deflate ourselves out of it at one level or tax ourselves out of it at one level, except if you do that, you're going to have other effects which are probably going to crush the economy. So in order to inflate ourselves out of it, we would have to create a very high inflation rate, and that's probably going to have negative effects on the economy. That means we won't, while we're getting more revenue via the inflation tax, which is what the inflating it away does, we're getting reduced tax revenue from other sources. So the problem is actually getting worse in terms of the expenditure growing relative to the size of the economy. We tried to fix it with standard taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, whatever. Maybe we could raise those a moderate amount without having a major negative effect on the growth of the economy, but to raise taxes enough to pay for the debts that we've taken on will slow the economy, and that just makes the problem even worse. So it's a serious problem.
Oh no, I'm sorry, it's a little bit tongue in cheek about this, but I've heard people say, "Well, so what if we've got debt? We'll just have more debt."
Well, I would ask such people how they would behave if that were going on in their own personal lives.
Right.
Of course, some debt is totally sensible. Taking out a mortgage in order to afford a house makes sense. A company that borrows in order to buy plant and equipment and make a productive, useful product, of course, that makes sense. But there are obviously limits. You can't borrow more than you could ever possibly repay. And what I'm saying, the arithmetic shows, is we're borrowing way more than we can plausibly repay.
And really, a lot of the other part of this that I was trying to get at a little bit is the payments for that debt too, right? As they rise, then that becomes a significant portion of the actual budget.
Exactly. And it's a vicious circle. As the debt gets higher, the people who are lending to us, the rest of the world, demands higher interest rates. That means the interest payments are higher, as you just pointed out. So that makes the debt worse, and then the whole thing keeps going. And so you end up in a situation like Greece or other countries that have had debt defaults.
So how far away are we from that kind of Grecian moment?
So now you're trying to get me to make a prediction. A famous economist said, predictions are hard, especially those about the future. But I suspect it's not going to happen in 10 years and probably not in 20, but I don't think it's much longer than that unless we change something, unless we introduce modifications to entitlements that slow their growth meaningfully relative to the current path.
Yeah. I mean, in part, I keep reading about different economists talking about this sort of demographic cliff, around 2027, 2028, just with, the baby boomers and entitlement and all those things coming together. Do you think, is that something you've looked at closely? And if you could comment on that?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, we are heading to the point where the major trust funds for the major entitlements are forecast to be, empty within sort of 5 to 15 years, depending on exactly which one we're looking at. And the baby boom generation is starting to, or has probably already started to retire, and is going to be retiring at a much faster rate going forward. Includes me, I think. And that puts more and more pressure. And the U.S. birth rate is low, and if anything, seems to be declining. So that means there are fewer and fewer young people who are working, paying taxes into these trust funds. So everything seems to be going in the wrong direction.
All right. So if we take the political issues out here, which is a big if, because the political capital is the one thing that any libertarian solution probably doesn't have right now, in either party for that matter.
Right.
Give me some policy changes that you think would actually help grow the United States economy, and potentially kind of overcome the debt with real GDP growth.
So I'll sound like a broken record, but I think the single most important thing is to moderate Medicare expenditure with higher ages of eligibility, with larger deductibles, with other sorts of cost sharing, so that it's not growing nearly so fast. And similar things, but with less urgency for Social Security. Second, I think that we are spending way too much on foreign entanglements. We don't need to be stationed in Afghanistan or Iraq or many other places around the world. We could reduce national defense spending non-trivially by paying more attention to what's actually in our interest to defend the country, as opposed to trying to be the policeman around the world. And then last but not least, my single favorite is we should repeal drug prohibition. It does not only terrible things to people who want to use drugs, it creates racial animosity, it generates crime, it distorts all sorts of other sort of decisions about policy. And without eliminating drug prohibition, we're not going to fix the opioid overdose. We're not going to change the huge racial animosity that we have. So that would be my third.
So I'm curious, the third one surprises me a little bit, that in terms of the impact that that would have. Is part of it the ability to, I mean, even to bring, what we have is illegal drugs right now and tax them appropriately, or make, create markets that are legit? I mean, how does that necessarily help the economy grow?
In terms of, helping the economy grow, I guess I interpret broadly as making the economy better. It means that people's resources we devoted to not evading the police, to not, they wouldn't be devoted to as much to criminal justice, to trying to stop crimes which shouldn't be crimes. It would mean vastly reduced expenditure on prisons and jails and prosecutors. So it's not going to affect the growth rate of GDP. I agree with that. That's a fair point. But I think in terms of having a healthy economy where people are devoted to entrepreneurship and not fighting each other, I think drug prohibition is still quite important.
The irony is that a lot of this is so rational that it's hard to sell to a country driven by reality sound bites. Anyway, this has been a very useful conversation. And how can we learn, Professor Miron, more about kind of your philosophy, libertarian philosophy, and just get educated more on some of those issues?
So I would first point people to the Cato Institute website, which has some of my work, but a lot work by lots and lots of libertarians on the whole range of policy issues. It's just cato.org. And if someone really wants to see my views in particular, I have a book that's available on standard websites like Amazon called Libertarianism from A to Z. And that's actually kind of a summary of the course that I teach that you mentioned at the beginning of the show.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. Well, thank you very much again for being on Wealth Formula Podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. I think Professor Miron is a really smart guy. The only thing I took exception with, the only thing I didn't like that he said, was that he assumed that I was a baby boomer. Okay? Did you catch that, by the way? I am not. I was born in 1973, making me very clearly Generation X. And just to be clear, it was Generation X that invented the internet. Okay? So I just want to get that off my chest, because when he said that, I was like, whoa, I'm doing this on video now. Are you saying that I look much older than I am? Certainly possible. I do have a lot of gray hair, but no, I think I still pretty much look Generation X. Now, seriously, though, one thing I forgot to ask Professor Miron about, which I did look him up on YouTube and saw an interesting video about, was what, at least in his opinion, I don't know if it's the libertarian opinion, what the ideal tax system looks like. And I thought it was interesting that he believes in a consumption tax rather than taxing your income, rather than, just saying you earn something, now we're going to take it. The tax would be flat. It wouldn't be different for anybody. And it would be really ultimately based on how much junk you bought, right? I mean, that's really what it would be, because it's consumption. It's based on, if you're buying stuff, it would be taxed there rather than in your income, which, the theory is that you would buy less junk and then, you would invest more, which is probably a good idea in general. Although I will say this, is that if you're taxing junk and the businesses that are out there produce junk, people will buy less of it if you invest in those businesses. So it is a tricky thing, but it's an interesting concept. Anyway, I do want to remind you again that I will be, I might not have even mentioned this before, but I will be in Dallas on September 14th and 15th at the Real Estate Guys Secrets of Syndication conference, and I'll be on a panel there. It's a good event, especially if you're interested potentially in the business of syndication. If you're interested in aggregating funds, maybe you're thinking about putting money together with some of your colleagues or whatever, and maybe take down some buildings or properties and stuff on your own. It's really a good event, and I think that Robert and Russ are great guys, and they're good friends of mine. So if you can make it, come out to Dallas with me in September 14th and 15th. Shoot me an email if you want more information on that. If you guys do make it out there, make sure to introduce yourself to me. Let's grab, some bourbon or something. You should probably have if enough of you are coming, maybe we'll have some kind of wealth formula get together or something. I don't know if you are or not, though. That's the thing. Anyway, that's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.